All right, perfect. It looks like everybody's joined. All right, my name is Mary Alice Olson. I'm the SVP of Client Services for Certemy, and I also lead licensing strategy. My heart is truly in regulation. If you haven't joined our Fireside Chat series before, every month I offer a regulatory fireside chat with a leader in the field. And it's just an opportunity for all of us to stay educated about the regulatory community. So today I'm extremely excited that we have my friend and someone that I got to hang out with when I was an executive director, Brian Carnahan. He is the executive director of the Ohio Counselor, Social Worker, and Marriage and Family Therapist Board. So he's got a huge job, and he's with us here today to talk about post-pandemic regulation. Are we ready for it? What does that look like? He's very much a forward thinker, and he's got, I think, a pretty accurate crystal ball that he uses. So very excited to have him here. Brian, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
All right, so just a couple of housekeeping items. We'll be talking for about 20 to 25 minutes where I'll just be asking Brian great questions. And throughout that time, we'd love if you would provide any questions that you have. You can use the QA feature in Zoom and just submit those throughout the conversation, because we'll leave the last 5 to 10 minutes of our 30-minute chat today to answer your questions. We love that audience participation, so definitely keep those questions coming. All right, so let's get started. Brian, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about the board, the professions that you regulate, and about how many licensees you regulate in total.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, our name sort of doesn't hold any secrets. We license counselors, social workers, and marriage and family therapists. We have about 40,000 licensees. The largest number social workers, but very strong contingent of counselors and marriage and family therapists. And we do that with a 15-member board, 12 of whom are licensed professionals. 3 of whom are public members, or what licensing guru, though, Dale Atkinson says everyone is a public member. So, but we do have 3 that aren't licensed by the board. And then 14 staff support that mission, both in licensing, investigations, and continuing education.
Okay, fantastic. That gives us a great overview and an idea of kind of where you're coming from, because of course, some callers are going to, or participants are going to be coming from really small boards or really large boards, and it really, where they might be the only staff person, or they might have 25 staff people, and so it's really helpful to kind of get that perspective. Do you mind also discussing the regulatory structure of your board too, just because that plays such a big part in kind of what you can and can't do as a board too?
Sure. Our licensing board, like all of the licensing boards or occupational licensing boards in Ohio, is essentially a state agency. So all of our members are appointed by the governor, and we also receive a lot of support from other state agencies for IT and HR and those sorts of operations sort of needs. So we're not independent as the case in some states, but we do have responsibility for the professions that we regulate.
Gotcha. So it's kind of a hybrid between sort of an umbrella model versus an independent licensing board, where you get a lot of support from your state agencies, but you do have some autonomy as well, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, correct. We're not embedded in a larger cabinet level agency as the case in some states, but we're also not off contracting for all of our own services, and we don't have quite that level of independence, which can be very nice at times when it comes to some of the IT needs and other things that we need to tackle.
Sure, no, that makes sense. Okay, great. That sets the stage perfectly. So I hope you've got your crystal ball ready. First question is a big one. Can you tell us what you think the post-pandemic regulatory community will look like? Because we're all, and I'll speak for myself, but I've definitely talked to other regulators that feel the same way. We've all just been in this sort of state of crisis for so long and just so reactive, right? And just rolling with the punches. But we have to start thinking about, okay, the future post-pandemic, and also with the understanding that this pandemic isn't going away anytime soon either. So if you could give us your thoughts, that would be great.
Sure. No, I think that we really have to get comfortable with the present and the future, because I think the past really is the past. We're not going back to exactly the way we've been doing things. And I think we're hearing that echoed throughout society and the economy and government. People are slowly coming to terms with the fact that it's not, we have a new normal. We won't go back to the normal. I sort of envision just a higher level of communication, because I think a lot of the boards have had to really ramp up our interactions with our licensees and share rule changes that are happening and be available for feedback and really establish a different relationship. And I think we'll see an environment with a lot more transparency and potentially stakeholder involvement. We were not holding online meetings. We could have broadcast our meetings, but we had not been. And I think that that's something that will change for us in the future, is really finding ways to bring licensees and stakeholders in, because we've been amazed by the involvement that we've seen with online meetings. Just dozens of people coming who wouldn't have made the trip to Columbus for an in-person meeting. And so that's very helpful. And we've actually had a chance to answer questions that we wouldn't have otherwise received. Sometimes the boards are even though we might be responsible for a license, not everyone is really understands what we do and how we do it and why we do it.
Very
and
true.
I think something else that we'll see is just a higher level of flexibility. Most of us have had to implement things for the pandemic that both workforce related for us as boards, but also for our licensees, that we're likely going to have to find some way to continue to do going forward. It will be hard to say, oh, now that the pandemic's over, no, we're going back to doing things this way. So those are sort of the areas where I really see things changing fairly significantly for regulating occupational licenses.
That makes absolute sense. And I loved what you said about get comfortable with the present, right? Because I do think a lot of us are thinking like, all right, we just have to survive what we're in right now, and then everything will go back to normal. We'll rescind all of those rules that we put in place, and everything will be fine again. And I think that ship has sailed. If that was ever possible, that ship has sailed. So I think that's a really great point to bring up. And so how do we prepare for this future that will very much speak to the present? Because you're right, we can't just roll back everything and expect licensees to be okay with that.
Yeah, a lot of in the space that I regulate in, a lot of folks have adopted teletherapy, and so it would be very hard to go back and tell a licensee who's invested time, money in getting the right platform and getting comfortable with it, that now we're going to significantly reduce that. We aren't. We have a very pre-pandemic, we had a very rigorous and fairly broad teletherapy policy. But I think it's those sorts of things where people are thinking, well, when the pandemic's over, we'll stop doing something like that. And I don't think that's the case. And we're seeing that national efforts to kind of push it from the federal level down. Mm-hmm. So, there are a lot of things that are part of what we're doing now that I think we're going to be finding ways to adapt to long term.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the example you brought up with the online board meetings is a really good one. I know that when you and I talked, previously you said that, sort of the first time you did it, you had hundreds of people attend your board meeting because I guess they felt like there was an obligation to on some level, which is so funny, just sort of human behavior. But then once they're there, they're like, all right, this is interesting. Maybe I'll keep coming.
Yeah, I think so. It was really a kind of a surreal experience to just see, the numbers get higher and higher and higher of the people logging in to watch. But I think that for many of them, they got a sense of, how the board operates, the people that are making these decisions, and hopefully that will continue, because we're not trying to hide anything, but yet we can only do so much to reduce those barriers to let people in. Sometimes they have to kind of step over that threshold. And hopefully those online meetings will help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've definitely talked about just the pros and cons of more engagement with licensees. I mean, I think overall it's great, providing a higher level of transparency, and then it builds that trust, but it is also that much more for you to manage. I mean, not all regulators are equipped with the skill set of managing essentially an online live forum where people are, just flooding you with questions, for example. I mean, regulators have really had to sort of twist and evolve in ways that I imagine none of them expected to have to do.
Yeah, the features of the technology, like the chat for public bodies, I think is a challenge, and we've had to make it clear that we can't engage that way, unfortunately. So, but yeah, I think those are all great points, and hopefully that will continue. There aren't a ton of downsides. I think anyone who views more public involvement and more stakeholder involvement probably shouldn't have one of these jobs, because I think it's in all of our best interests that particularly our licensees really understand what we do and why we do it.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I think that can only be helpful so that they understand, for example, that some of the rules and restrictions you put in place, they really are about protecting the public and how, and sort of understand the very difficult decisions that you face in every board meeting, and also see how much you and your board members struggle over making decisions too, right? It's not that you're just sort of like, you lose your license, right? I mean, these are really difficult decisions that you put a lot of time into. And so it's great to provide that transparency.
Absolutely.
So another piece that I know a lot of regulators are thinking about is, they've had to make changes really quickly with regard to their staff, who can no longer work at the board office, for example, or maybe just a couple of days a week, and just sort of the, trying to balance all of that, if you will. Do you think that state agencies should really begin preparing for a mostly online workforce, and that boards should really build that into their strategic plan of most of board staff really working remotely as needed?
Well, I think that for many of us, the answer to this question is going to be driven in part by how we administer our boards, or how we're structured within our state. Mm-hmm. So here in Ohio, the administration has been very active in discussing return to work with state agencies and boards, and has been looking at office space considerations as part of a broader strategic effort. And so I really think that all of us need to be really looking at how we're operating, and if we are working outside of working remotely, is that are we as productive as we were in the office, and can that continue? It's something that we're definitely engaged in looking at. I've polled my team, and virtually all of them, with one or two exceptions, want at least some access to be able to continue a high level of remote work. And I think that we're seeing the benefits from it. I don't think that there are huge disruptions, and it's we'll have been working out of the office for nearly a year fairly soon. And wow. That's something that's, it's hard to think about, but that's something that will be very difficult to, encourage people to change. But there are a lot of factors involved, how much space you're using, what the demands are for technology, and those sorts of questions, because not all of us are set up to be able to operate online as much as others. We've been fairly lucky in that most of what we need can be received online, but we still do get some hard copies. And that's actually, if we were able to get everything online, we would probably have, even fewer visits to the office. So.
Absolutely. I know that you when you and I spoke previously, you mentioned, anything that's sort of required to still be handled via paper, like, for example, universities that are just not on board with submitting transcripts via an online mechanism, and instead are still saying that it's only an official transcript if it's mailed to the board office, that those sorts of processes are just sort of sticking out. as a real challenge, because then that puts your staff in a position of having to go to the board office when they could have completed that work from home, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this is also then presenting those universities with an opportunity to explore making those changes. And we're lucky in that we have, some aspects in our rules where we can accept copies of certain things. So in some instances, the applicant may have that document that would have come as a hard copy. So that can be helpful. But yeah, some of the bigger institutions have maybe been a little bit slower to respond. But we're sympathetic. We're a rules-based organization. There are things that we can't just stop doing or start doing without a certain process. And I think, a lot of those programs are in that same position, and then potentially having to make, the technology investment and to make all of those decisions during this time might be asking a bit much.
That's a great point, and it sort of brings up another idea that we've discussed, which is, right now you're getting a lot of support, it sounds like, from your state agencies, for example, to make a lot of changes kind of on the fly, if it's emergency rules or changing, how and when your staff works. In the future, do you think that you'll have quite as much support sort of when the crisis is over? Because I think that'll actually change what you can and can't do moving forward as well, or at least affect it.
Well, that is a good question. I think that we'll have, generally the same level of support, but I think when it's easier, I think, to encourage people to help resolve certain problems when resolving the problem is required. When there's a mandate that, every person who can be working from home be working from home. Once it's more voluntary, we may face, some different challenges in coordinating how all of that works. But I expect that given the high level of service that we get, we'll be able to continue to do that. But it does change the dynamic a little bit. I mean, I think when we're all sort of, having to row together in the same way, it makes things a bit different than when maybe some agencies are doing some, working from home, others aren't. But I expect that, we'll be in a solid position.
Good. No, that's really good to hear, for sure. So in terms of just thinking through support, right, and how things change based on sort of the politics of the day, do you think that regulators should expect an increase in deregulatory efforts? Essentially, some of the groups that we all know that sort of go after licensing boards, if you will. Not that all deregulation efforts are bad. I don't mean to imply that, but you would think that this sort of gives some fuel to the fire, really, in terms of what boards have had to change as a result of a pandemic.
Yeah, I think that, all of us who were paying attention to these issues, and I'm guessing it's anyone who's on a chat like this, realizes that there is a big push for deregulation and occupational licensing. And I really see this as just accelerating it, partially because I think we're really learning what works. In the telehealth space, we're really seeing that people can deliver good services that way. And I think many of us knew that before, but we're seeing it now. We're also seeing, we're through dealing with pandemic related issues, we're getting an opportunity just to look at our processes overall and rules, and getting a chance to identify things that maybe we'd like to explore changing longer term. And so I think it adds into that deregulatory effort. Many of us know Arizona started with a pretty big effort. Pennsylvania has had its effort. Ohio has two fairly comprehensive bills pending right now. So I really think that we're going to see those efforts increase. And also, we're seeing more talk about what the feds can do. Now, with federalism, of course, they can't tell all of us exactly how to license, but we're seeing, I'm seeing certainly in various newsletters from groups left, right, center that are talking more about what the federal government can do. So I think we'll be, facing more questions about how we license, who we license, and why, our restrictions are what they are and in other states are what theirs are, and so forth.
I think it's a great point that, on one level, and we've talked about this on other fireside chats around the pandemic, on one level, it's given everybody an opportunity to say, okay, what areas of our laws or not laws, but rules can we make changes can we streamline? What can we do with regard to policies or applications in terms of cutting out unnecessary pieces of information that we're requiring, for example. So in that way, I think it's a great thing. I think the scary part is if people try to use the changes that boards had to make to keep people out there helping the public in a meaningful way as an argument for why a board should be dissolved or a profession shouldn't be regulated. And we, obviously there are those groups that are going to take it to that extreme. But I think there are other legislators, for example, that might just say, take this as an opportunity to see what barriers you can reduce. And I think boards are kind of always stuck in this in-between spot, right? Because some boards can lobby, some boards can't. But either way, your mission is to protect the public. And so how do you make sure the public's still protected while reducing burdens for your licensees? Because that's something that probably every board could do.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is an interesting constraint. Not every board can advocate for its interests in the same way. One thing that we've seen in Ohio, which is kind of interesting, is that even though there's an effort on some reciprocity bills, some of the biggest supporters of those bills are also supporting efforts to create compacts. Mm-hmm. So that's a good indication that they recognize the need for licensure, but also recognize that we need to be careful about what barriers we establish and what processes are in place. And that may be a direction that we'll actually see increase a little bit more, because we're seeing, we every day are fielding questions from folks who are in other states that have clients moving here or, been contacted by someone. And I think, we want to make sure that people get great care, but the rules aren't necessarily always aligned properly to ensure that happens. And a lot of these efforts that are being discussed now would make that process a lot smoother for us and help the clients and the therapists as well.
I think that's a fantastic point. I've absolutely seen the same trend with the same legislators that are pushing for reduced regulation are also the ones backing compacts. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a lot of their concern is about restricting practice across state lines, and that being very difficult to move from one state to another. Which is just, a challenge that every profession faces for the most part because of how they were formed and the rules just being really different and the laws being really different in terms of how a profession came to be in each state. So a continued struggle. Great point there. All right, so we have about 6 minutes left. We do have a couple of questions that have popped in. So I'll grab those. All right, so one question. What are the one or two things that are temporary now that you do not want to become permanent, and why? So I think really he's referring to maybe some rules or policies that you put in place during the pandemic that you may not want to continue in the future.
Well, that's a great question. I'm not, and I wish I had a more eloquent answer, but I'm not sure that we've done anything yet where I look at it and say, okay, we definitely can't have that moving forward. One thing that we have done is, because we have a rule for conditional permission to practice, we have had a more streamlined application process for that. And I think by doing that, we've created a bit of a burden at times just internally. And that's something that I think in the future will go back to the standard application process we have, because the demand from clinicians will be different. But
Sure.
So far, there hasn't been something where I feel like we were forced to do it in a way that runs contrary to, for lack of a better term, the interests of the board. But that is an interesting question. I hadn't thought much about what we might want to stop doing as much as what we need to keep doing.
It is a good question for sure. So in thinking about staff and staff working from home and just kind of going back to that question, we also have someone that has a question about sort of the hiring process. Do you have experience hiring people remotely? Is that something that you think boards are going to have to kind of get used to doing as well?
We have hired one person. Now we're a small team, so we're 14 people. So thankfully, we're not hiring all that frequently. I won't take too much credit for that, but our turnover is very low, which is nice. So we did recently hire someone, and I really was very comfortable with the process that we engaged in. It we did video interviews, and I think it was a very smooth process. I mean, when you think about an interview, it's really, well, it's nice to, be able to reach across a table and maybe shake someone's hand. Certainly not something we could do right now, of course, but I didn't feel like being present with that person was at all necessary to assess, skills and interests. So it went fairly smoothly. Now, the challenge that we have had is a little bit with the onboarding, because it's very challenging to get someone all of the training and information they need without bringing them into the office. So we do have someone who is coming in occasionally, and so that has been the challenge, that onboarding process. But we were lucky in that we were able to give every one of our staff a laptop and get all of the technology set up. So they've been able to work from home some of the time and not have to be in the office. But I would think that I wouldn't mind doing it post-pandemic, because it also allowed us to schedule the interviews a little bit more frequently and do them back to back, which was nice.
That is nice. Yeah, definitely some pros and cons. So I know we just have 2 minutes left, and so maybe we can squeeze in 2 more questions. And thank you all for the participation. So one question: how are you directly monitoring your staff that are working from home, or are you?
So we do 3 staff calls a week where we are all on video. Though we do have a rule: everyone has to be on video one of the 3 calls a week. So not everyone has to get up and be ready to appear for the world for that call. And then staff do submit a work log at the end of the week, just with a quick update. And I think that just because of the size of the team, we interact a lot, questions about, licensure questions and things. So, I have a really good sense of I'd like to think of the workload for the staff. And I think that we went into it with a high level of trust. I think that's the difference. If, going forward, if we work in this way for quite a bit longer, I think it does change the dynamic a little bit, and there might have to be some different accountability. But we haven't, for example, implemented anything where we're watching Skype to see whether someone is online or anything like that. So it's, I think part of it has been trust.
Absolutely. No, that makes sense. All right, we have 1 minute left. I'm not sure if you can answer this in 1 minute, but we'll see. Do you have more problems now with unlicensed practice across state lines because of telepractice in Ohio? And are you having to address that in any meaningful way?
It's one of those things we're not sure. I feel bad saying this, but I suspect that the people who ask us questions about whether they can practice in the state are unfortunately the tip of an iceberg. So we're probably getting people who are continuing to follow their clients that probably shouldn't. And
Right.
There's not much we can do about that until we get a complaint. And even then, we're very constrained in what we could do. So, I mean, it is concerning, but we have to, live with a certain level of uncertainty.
I think you're definitely not alone with that as well. I felt that same pain, so understand.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I can't thank you enough for your time today and your expertise and your forward-thinking brain. It's been really great to explore this with you, and really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right, great. And just as a matter of housekeeping, you will all receive a video of our chat. And if you have any remaining questions for Brian that you didn't get a chance to ask today, let me know and I'll make sure to filter those to Brian so that he can help you. I know he'd be more than happy. So, all right, perfect. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.